Snow came down in thick, lazy sheets, drifting sideways in the wind until it found skin to sting and roofs to bury. The cold had a sound to it, a brittle, needling hiss that crept beneath coats and gnawed at the bones. By mid-morning the town square was full of it, frost curling along the plank walls, ice stiffening the church bell rope until it hung like frozen sinew. Boots crunched on hard-packed dirt dusted white, each step sharp as breaking glass. People came anyway, collars turned high, breath clouding in the air, faces pinched from more than just the cold. At the center of it all stood a platform no higher than a wagon bed, its boards warped and grayed from seasons of use. Two thick men in coats stood flanking the middle like pillars of ice, their eyes flat, unbothered by the wind. Between them stood the reason everyone had braved the weather. She was bound at the wrists with coarse rope, the fibers biting raw into skin rubbed red. Snowflakes clung stubbornly to her hair, the strands matted into stiff, uneven locks. Her dress, once a soft blue perhaps, now looked more like washed-out ash, a stitched tear just above the knee showing a thin line of pale skin. She didn't shiver, didn't blink against the wind's bite. Her gaze rested somewhere far off, over the heads of the crowd, beyond the rooftops, past the horizon altogether. The auctioneer's voice rose above the cold. It was a cracked, weathered sound, as if the wind itself had lived inside his throat too long. "She can work," he barked, drawing out the words like the promise of a rare commodity. "She can cook. She'll mind her tongue. Who'll start the bidding?" Around him, men shifted in their boots, the sound of leather and iron spurs filling the spaces between the words. They were ranchers with frost in their beards, prospectors whose eyes measured everything in worth, drifters who leaned on fence rails with smirks just shy of mean. Their stares weighed her the way cattlemen weighed a yearling, calculating muscle, obedience, longevity. A few faces showed nothing but curiosity. Others twisted in something sharper, a cruel enjoyment at the spectacle. Wind shoved its way through the crowd, rattling shutters along the street. The church bell swayed slightly on its frozen rope, but made no sound, like even God was holding his breath. At the far edge of the gathering, partly shadowed by the snow-muted facade of the general store, a man stood alone. His coat was long and worn at the seams, the leather stiff from years of weather. Snow powdered the brim of his hat, the wind tugging at its edges, without reward. The badge on his chest had lost its shine long ago. The silver dulled almost black, the etching faded, but it was there all the same. His eyes were the sort that carried time in them, not in years, but in the weight of things seen, done, buried. They scanned the platform, then the crowd, then returned to her. He made no move to join in, didn't lean closer to hear the first offers. He stood still as an old pine, hands in the open front of his coat, watching. The first bid came from a man near the front, his voice sharp against the cold. Others followed, each number called out with the energy of a game. A round of laughter rose when one man joked about breaking her improper. Another added something that drew more chuckles, though the wind caught the words before they could carry to the back. Somewhere in the mass of wool and leather, a small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. She pulled him in close, turned his head toward her coat, hiding his eyes from the platform. Her jaw was set, not against the weather, but against the scene in front of them. The woman's stillness didn't break. Only once, when a man in a frayed brown coat spat in the snow at her feet, did anything shift. Her jaw tightened. Not much, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. She didn't lower her gaze. The sheriff, though no one called him that to his face anymore, saw it. That small flicker. His own hand drifted slightly, fingertips brushing the worn grip of his Colt. Not a threat, not readiness, just habit. The numbers climbed. Voices called over one another, the harshness of the bids mingling with the bite of the wind. Somewhere a door slammed against its frame, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the brittle air. Up on the platform, the auctioneer stamped his boots and cupped his hands around his mouth, shouting the last call. His voice cracked again, the word sold, slapping the cold air like a flag in the wind. The man who had offered the final sum stepped forward, a figure built wide through the shoulders, his coat stretched tight over them. His hat brim shadowed a face carved in hard lines, the kind born from work and a temper to match. A grin touched his mouth, though it held no warmth. He took the rope from the platform man's hands and yanked it just enough to make her step down. She did so without stumbling, without a sound. From the far edge of the crowd, the sheriff's fingers came to rest fully on the butt of his gun. Not drawn, not even loosened. Just there, the weight of it resting against his palm, as if to remind him it still existed. No one noticed the way his eye stayed on her as the rancher led her through the snow, the crowd parting in uneven lines. No one heard the thought in his head, the one that had no shape yet, but carried the heaviness of something inevitable. Snow kept falling, piling in the corners of doorways and along the tops of hats, clinging to coats and lashes. It muffled the shuffle of boots, softened the sound of the wagon creaking as the rancher loaded her in. It was the kind of snow that stayed long after the day was gone, that left the world quiet and colorless, as if holding its breath for whatever came next. The wagon's wheels groaned over the frozen ruts as it rolled out of town, each turn scattering chunks of brittle snow. The woman sat in the back, her hands unbound now but resting limply in her lap, the rope burns on her wrists dark against pale skin. She didn't look at the rancher who held the reins, didn't look at the road. Her eyes were fixed ahead, though the landscape held nothing but skeletal cottonwoods and miles of white. Far behind, the sheriff's horse kept an easy, unhurried pace. He sat straight in the saddle, his hat brim cutting the glare of the winter sky. There was no urgency in him, no leaning forward as if to close the distance. The animal moved like it understood. This wasn't a chase. This was something slower, heavier, as if each step carried the weight of more than just snow. Wind swept through the valley in long, aching moans, shoving cold through wool and leather. Somewhere in that sound memory surfaced, unbidden, sharp. A flash of red staining fresh snow. A farmhouse collapsing into fire, the timbers snapping like gunshots. A young girl's hand slipping from his grasp, her eyes as wide and silent as the woman's now. Then the image was gone, swallowed by the wind, leaving only the steady rhythm of hooves in the snow. By the time the ranch came into view, the day was tilting toward dusk, the sky bruising along the edges. She climbed down from the wagon when told, carrying no bundle, no coat beyond what she wore. Work began before she'd warmed her hands. A bucket and brush for the frozen floors, water so cold it stung her skin. She knelt and scrubbed, the ice biting through the thin fabric of her dress. When that was done, the rancher handed her an axe and pointed to the woodpile. The air was so sharp it scraped the inside of her throat. Her breath rose in clouds that broke apart and vanished in seconds. The rancher's wife kept her distance, speaking in clipped gestures and short commands. The hired men lingered just far enough to watch without being caught at it, their faces caught between pity and warning. Night brought no relief. She was given a blanket barely thicker than paper and sent to the storage shed, a squat, uninsulated building where the air hung heavy with the smell of dried grain and cold earth. She curled on a cot against the wall, drawing her knees tight, trying to keep her breath inside the cocoon of cloth. Outside, the wind kept its low, restless song. In town, the sheriff was seen riding in the same direction more often than before. Folks noticed. "Why's he been going that way?" someone asked in the saloon. "Ain't none of his business," another said, not quite loud enough to sound sure. He didn't answer anyone. Nights found him at his small table, the lamp turned low, a cloth in his hand as he worked oil into the joints of his Colt. He'd pause sometimes, eyes drifting to the door like he was listening for a knock that never came. When the gun was clean, he'd set it aside and sit still for long minutes, his fingers tapping the edge of the table, the ticking of the wall clock loud in the quiet. Her face came to him then, not the woman's, but his sister's, the last winter he'd seen her alive. She'd worn that same guarded stillness, as if motion or sound might shatter the only piece of herself she had left. He remembered hating the quiet then. Now it seemed the only thing worth keeping. Days at the ranch stretched long. The rancher's temper shortened with each one. Her refusal to speak beyond what was necessary grated at him. He tried to goad her into reaction, sharp words, insults flung in passing. When that didn't work, his hands grew rougher, the grip on her arm tighter, the shove through a doorway harder. She absorbed it without raising her voice. But one night in the barn, We caught her by the wrist and dragged her closer. She spat in his face. The barn went still. His hand hung in the air like he wasn't sure whether to strike or not. Then he shoved her back and stormed out, cursing into the snow. Word of it reached town before morning. The sheriff heard it at the feed store, the telling laced with smirks and a half-hearted laugh. He didn't respond. He stepped outside, adjusted the cinch on his horse, and rode out without a word. The shed was colder that night, the wind cutting through the cracks in the boards and spilling frost onto the floor. She sat on the cot, the bruise on her cheek dark in the lamplight that leaked through the slats. Her breath rose in pale clouds, her hands folded tight in her lap. Snow muffled the sound of approaching footsteps, but the rhythm of them, slow, deliberate, cut through the wind. She looked toward the door, her body still. A shadow blocked the light under the threshold. The latch lifted, and the door opened against the push of the cold. A shaft of light fell inside, gold against the dark. He stood there, hat low, coat dusted white. The wind caught the edge of his coat, but he didn't step aside. He just stood in the doorway, looking at her. The snow was falling again when he rode into the ranch yard. No rush in his stride, no theatrics in his face, just that steady, heavy presence that made men weigh their words before speaking. The rancher was by the fence, splitting a log with a maul, his breath steaming in the cold. The woman was carrying a pail from the well, shoulders hunched against the wind. The sheriff stepped down from his horse, boots crunching on the packed snow. He walked past the gate without asking, eyes on the rancher. "She's coming with me." It wasn't barked or begged, just stated, as if it were already decided. The rancher straightened, the maul still in his hand. "She's paid for," he said, spitting into the snow. "Ain't your concern, lawman." The sheriff didn't move, didn't blink. His hand rested loosely near his holster, not daring the man, just making clear the option was there. The air between them seemed colder than the weather, still and sharp enough to cut skin. "You best turn around." The rancher tried again, a bit louder this time, the edge of bluster creeping in. The sheriff didn't. The wind worried at his coat, lifting the hem. His gaze never left the man's eyes, and the silence grew until even the sound of the snow settling seemed loud. Finally, the rancher shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Not worth dying over." He dropped the maul, the wood at his feet splitting with a dull crack, and stomped toward the barn. The woman hadn't moved during any of it. Only when the sheriff walked toward her did she set the pail down. He didn't take her by the arm or offer a hand up. He just led the way to the horse, mounted, and waited until she climbed up behind him. They left without a word, the hoofbeats muffled under the falling snow. The land was a white expanse that swallowed sound, the horizon blurred where the ground met the sky, both carrying the same washed-out gray. Her hands gripped the back of his coat at first loosely, then more firmly as the wind pulled at them. He didn't look back, didn't ask anything. She didn't speak either, but there was a steadiness in her hold now, a trust that hadn't been there before. The ride seemed longer than the distance warranted. Snow piled in drifts along the edges of the trail, the world empty except for them and the faint whisper of the wind moving through the bare cottonwoods. When they reached the cabin, he swung down and tied the horse. The place was small, 2 windows, a stone chimney, smoke curling faintly from it. He pushed the door open, letting her step inside first. It was warm in there, the heat from the wood stove wrapping around like a thick blanket. The air smelled of pine and coffee. He poured her a tin cup of it, the steam curling upward into the dim light. A heel of bread sat on the table. He set that beside the cup without comment. Then he stepped back out, leaving the door closed behind him. She sat down slowly, as though the chair might vanish beneath her. Her fingers wrapped around the cup, absorbing the warmth before bringing it to her lips. She ate the bread in small bites, eyes flicking around the room, the stove, the shelves lined with jars, the single bed in the corner. It was the look of someone measuring how long such warmth could last. In town, the whispers started before evening. They carried in the corners of the saloon, along the length of the general store counter. "Sheriff brought her here. Ain't proper." Lost his mind, keeping her up there. Some voices held curiosity, others disapproval, and few carried the sharp edge of resentment. Two men came up to the cabin before the night was out, knocking hard enough to rattle the latch. He opened the door, just enough to stand in the gap. They started to talk, about appearances, about the law, about what people might think. He answered by shutting the door in their faces, the thud muffled by the snow outside. The night settled deep. She sat at the table long after the bread was gone, staring into the dark beyond the window. Somewhere in the quiet, the sound of chopping reached her ears, rhythmic, deliberate, the thunk of blade into wood. She stood and crossed to the window. Outside, under the steady fall of snow, he worked by the stack, splitting logs and tossing them into a pile. The lamplight from inside caught in the flakes drifting down, making the whole scene slow and muted, like a memory she wasn't sure was hers. Her hand rested on the table beside the empty cup he had left her. The stove crackled, the warmth in the room a fragile thing she held onto without knowing why. Outside, he kept splitting wood, and the snow kept falling.